supervisors, is that right?
Right.
Okay. And who is the ultimate supervisor of the Scottsdale Police Department?
Chief of police.
Okay. So, did your investigation reveal when everybody's supervisor first became aware that Chief Slavin had made inappropriate or harassing or discriminatory comments in a meeting?
I've heard part of that, but not all of it. Can you ask it again, please?
I'll ask again. We're talking about whether the other people in the meeting appropriately relied on supervisors or command staff or the chief to know about this complaint. When was the first time that your investigation revealed that all of these other witnesses to the comments were informed that the chief knew already?
I don't recall them. I'm not sure if the chief knew that they knew about, that they made those comments. We only knew about it in 085.
I'll ask again. The day after the meeting,
Okay.
your investigation revealed that Chief Slavin sent an email, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And Chief Rodbell was copied on that email, was he not?
Yes.
Okay. Given the fact that Chief Rodbell is everybody's supervisor, did your professional judgment tell you that AR 333 required those other meeting attendees to additionally notify their supervisor?
No, because there's an email to all of them and it was CC to the big chief.
Those are all the questions I have.
Okay, I'm gonna ask the vice chair if he has any questions. I do have some questions, and then I'll give both council a chance to follow up on their questions. Vice chair, do you have some
Yes,
questions?
sir, I do. Thank you. Sergeant Lewis, prior to the commander's administrative leave on October 2nd, can you characterize or describe what kind of relationship you had with him?
With Commander Minor?
Yes.
I thought it was cordial. We weren't friendly, but we were friendly.
I asked that because as you have suggested, and the transcript suggested it when I read them initially, he seemed to be fighting you a tad in both of his interviews. And I'm just asking if there's something that we don't know about the working relationship.
Not at all. I would respect Commander Minor.
When this first opened up, and you had the first interview on June 28th with Slavin, were you present?
When I had the,
There was 2 interviews that day, on June 28th. There was Slavin first, and then Minor.
oh,
You
pardon.
had Minor. Were you part of the Slavin?
Yeah, I did the Slavin interview.
You did.
Yes, sir.
Wasn't your partner not part of Minor because he was typing up the notes from the Slavin interview?
I think he was working on something else. That's my recollection.
Okay, but you were a part of both interviews that day.
Yeah, yes, they were basically both my interviews.
I'm going to read from AR 333. And it states, any supervisor receiving a complaint must inform Human Resources and/or Diversity and Dialogue as soon as possible in order to allow the city to investigate all complaints thoroughly, expeditiously, and professionally. And that only changes from the earlier version with the insertion of and/or Diversity and Dialogue. Otherwise, the intent is the same. So we have an incident on the 9th of May, what appears to be a 333 violation. Smith calls Slavin the next day, on the 10th, saying somebody is offended. Minor sees Slavin that same day and reports that what he heard was shocking. And then we have Minor on the 14th calling Pop and saying both he and Vanette were offended. So now we have the chief knowing about this. We have his two assistant chiefs knowing about this. Are you aware of any of the three connecting with HR saying we may have an issue here?
I'm not aware of any of that.
Thank you. After you interviewed Minor on a Friday, you went on to a Vanette interview on Tuesday, and you learned much more on Tuesday about a possibly offended party than you did on Friday. And Vanette shared words like he was shocked, he had communicated via text, what the hell, it was disgusting what he heard. When you got such a very different version on Tuesday from what you walked away on Friday from the Minor, did you go back to Minor and say, what the heck?
No, I did not.
Is there a reason you didn't circle back?
I was trying to get 16 interviews done, and it just didn't jump out at me at that point.
The disparity did not hit you?
The disparity did not hit me.
Okay. I want to go to one other document. General Orders 1410. Time limits. To establish reasonable time limits for investigating employee misconduct, CPs are not accepted more than 90 days after the incident is alleged to have occurred. From the time of the Minor interview to the time of the Minor investigation, there were 95 days. Did you bring up the issue of why are we doing this when it's beyond what policy calls for?
Because the policy actually states that there's exceptions to that.
It does.
It's one being the chief, commander level and above. So when the chief said that was, the investigation's gonna happen, that's what's gonna happen.
I have one last question. From the time of the incident on May 9th to the time you basically handed this letter from POSA by the chief on 6/27 saying, we've got a matter here. Did you at all ask about, this is 48 days later, what's going on?
No, I didn't ask the chief that. I don't think I asked anybody that.
Are there any times where you would ask the chief, why do we have these big delays, these gaps, when this is supposed to be something with great urgency behind it?
I've never asked him to say anything like that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sergeant Lewis, I have some questions. First, thank you for coming and thank you for going through this procedure process. Probably one would call it things towards most position. But a couple of questions. First, in the 85 report, page 5 of 41, if you go down about 9 lines, if you can pull that up, there should be a hard copy of that.
I'm sorry, what page was it, sir?
5 of 41.
Okay, I am there.
You go down about the 9th line, it's the one that begins with the word Mendoza.
Yes, sir.
And it says that email showed, it was copied to Chief Randall. In the email, Chief Slavin apologized and said his comments were inappropriate and unprofessional. The words inappropriate and unprofessional being italicized in quotes. That's not a true statement, that's not an accurate statement.
I think it does say that in his email.
I thought it said, did it? I have it? It was brought to my attention today that I made an inappropriate comment in yesterday's meeting. I do remember making the comment, and I'm emphasizing that
Yes,
word.
sir.
And I'm truly sorry for doing so. It was a failed attempt at a joke. It was certainly unprofessional. For anyone who was offended, please accept my sincere apology. So his email, which would have been the only document that was produced on May 10th, or anything related to what happened on May 9th, up to May 10th, only refers to one comment. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it is, but he is talking about it being inappropriate and unprofessional.
Comment.
Yes.
Not more
but
than
that's-
one.
Oh, you're referring to my word comment versus comments?
Yes, and that's why I asked in your report, you talk about him apologizing for his comments. So that's not an accurate statement in report 85, page 541.
In the context of his email, you're correct.
That's, I don't want to belabor this, but the sentence has to do with his, email. In page 541, does it not?
Well, yes, but obviously I thought it meant multiple things.
Right, and that's the important aspect of this whole case, is what people thought it said. Just as counsel said, Chief Rebell was told, the Assistant Chief said Laban's comments, because he was told by Assistant Chief Slavin as he was required to do. But as the Vice Chair pointed out, there's something more that has to be done when that's done. And now we know that the chief received an email that uses the word singular comments, and there's no record of what the conversation was with the chief. So is it fair to say that we're left with a situation where we don't know if it's one comment was told to the chief or two comments?
I think that's, yeah, I don't know of any comment or comments made to the chief.
Also, and I don't believe this is subject to the exclusions, like you mentioned in opening statements, there was reference to part of the activities.
They send in complaints, but, well, they send in multiple complaints.
Well, that actually, maybe I'm thinking something occurs that actually doesn't work that way. Is it typical that Mr. Mendoza doesn't take complaints and refer those to the chief? The way-
Yes.
Okay, so okay, that's a misunderstanding. When you were asked, or maybe I mentioned early on when I interrupted counsel, why this was done as a part 2 and not a part 1, I thought you said that one of the key factors, and remember what you said, not what I'm telling you, what I think you said, that the distinction was whether someone was offended. Is that why this was investigated as a part 2 versus a part 1?
The distinction that I was trying to make was that someone from that protected class was not present to be offended. I found it offensive. I knew someone from that protected class would find it offensive. And that's why I did it as a part 2. But because they weren't present in the meeting, I did not do it as a part 1 violation.
Well, how do you know that no one who was a member of the protected class was in the meeting?
I did ask everybody.
Well, that's, I think you just got into the number one question. When you start the investigation, you don't know, correct?
That's correct, I don't know.
So how did you determine to investigate it as a part 2 investigation versus a part 1 if you didn't know whether it was a part 1 investigation?
Well, generally, they would have told me if they were offended to a particular point. I know that Lieutenant Melissa Palpoli, who is a friend of mine, is openly gay.
You say they would have told you. So am I operating again under a misunderstanding for which I apologize? Did you make the decision that this was a part 2 investigation until you completed the investigation?
Yeah, I mean, yes, sir.
And so if someone were in the meeting that was gay, this would have been a part 1 investigation?
I believe so.
You know, I looked at these, when I first got this, and I want to be clear on this in June, I went through all the people at the interviews at that time, and I looked at some of the other ones. I don't remember ever seeing a question that you asked anyone if they were gay.
No, I did not.
So how would you have known if someone were gay to cause this to become a part 1 investigation? If if you didn't ask them, and that's the critical factor as to whether or not this is a part one investigation.
Well, like I said a second ago, generally I would expect them to tell me. Now, I'm not gonna ask somebody if they're gay or not, but if they're a part of a protected class, generally they would tell me.
Well, isn't that the point?
I'm
Why,
confused
when
by
someone
what you're-
makes a homophobic statement, it ought to go through part one? Because they may not want you to know that they're gay for whatever reason.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused by what you just
Let
said,
me
so.
just expand this. Protected classes include people who have disabilities, correct?
Yes, my son has a disability, my grandson has a disability.
Well, someone could make a joke about people who are disabled. And there may be an employee of the police department who hears that and is offended because they are disabled, but they don't want anyone to know. That would be considered a part two investigation, not a part one? Because they're not gonna tell you,
Right,
oh, by the way.
I don't have the information given to me in order to make that determination. That's true, and I didn't ask if someone was part of that protected class.
I just want to go through the timing here. You received the assignment to investigate the comments by Assistant Chief Slavin. Was that on June 28th in the morning, or was that on June 27th? And June 28th is the day you had the interview with Assistant Chief Slavin and Commander Meyer.
June 28th.
Okay, right, so you must have gotten that sometime before your interview with Assistant Chief Slavin. That interview started when you spoke to Chief Rodbell about one or two comments. There's no record of whether it was one or two, is that correct?
I'm sorry, I need to amend, sir. I was on June 27th.
Okay,
Page
27th.
2. Yeah, I had a meeting, started to go on, I had a meeting with Chief Rodbell.
Okay, so at that time, you had spoken to Chief, you got the assignment, you spoken to Chief Rodbell, and he either talked to you, told you about one or two comments. Did he give you Assistant Chief Slavin's email that referred to singular comment?
I don't remember if he gave me the email. I'm reading so I can refresh my memory. Yes, he did. That time he provided us with an email.
Okay, and did he also give you the email that Mr. Mendoza provided to the chief?
No, I think I had to get that from Damien.
And when did you get that? Was it, right, yes.
It's shortly after the meeting. I interrupted you, I'm sorry. Shortly after the meeting with Chief Rodbell, I emailed Damien and asked for the email.
Okay, so, and actually what I was trying to find out was, when you spoke to Assistant Chief Slavin on the 28th, at 1:28 in the afternoon, did you have the email from Mr. Mendoza?
Yes.
And then, I think your testimony earlier was that things were sort of rushed. So you didn't ask, you hadn't read that email or didn't look at it clearly?
Well, I didn't sit down and examine the email and break it apart in pieces and try to figure out exactly every piece of it because I was trying to adjust this to Commander Miner's, Chief Slavin's schedule, Commander Miner's schedule. But I knew I could call them back. So to me, it was, let's get some interviews in the hopper so we can get working on this. They're going out to their vacations, and then I can start interviewing the rest of the people. But it wasn't that had to be my last interview with Chief Slavin.
It looks like, well, it was sent to the chief in the morning, 8:55 a.m. I don't have a copy of what was sent to you. The first paragraph is 3.5 lines, and And it says multiple members of the Scottsdale Police Department independently brought forward an allegation that on or about May 9, 2019, in a staff meeting, Assistant Chief Slavin made a homophobic remark and then followed up by asking a meeting attendee about the attendee's sexual orientation during the meeting. You looked at the email, you didn't read that first paragraph before you spoke to?
So I read the whole thing before I spoke to him.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that I ignored the email.
Oh, okay, so you knew that Assistant Chief Slavin had made 2 comments. Is that fair? When you spoke to him?
Yeah, I didn't sit and break it down like, oh, there's 2 comments there. I wanted to get the story from Chief Slavin. And that's how I moved forward, knowing that I could always come back to anybody at any time.
Well, you said you wanted to get the story from Chief Slavin, but then the argument earlier was you sort of treat the object of an internal affairs investigation a little different than the questions you asked. So how would you expect, how could you get the whole story from Assistant Chief Slavin if he seemingly wasn't required to give you the whole story unless you asked a specific question?
So I can get, when I interview somebody, I can ask, we do it in a conversational format where they tell me what they remember, and I can come back to them and ask them more direct questions based on further stuff. As you move down through the investigation, as you know, in these internal affairs things, I can go back to people and ask extra questions. So I didn't think I was limited by one interview with Chief Slavin or one interview with Commander Minor.
Well, when you came to your conclusion, your report, you didn't go back to Assistant Chief Slavin, did
No,
you?
sorry, no.
Even though by that time you knew there were 2 comments.
Yes, and that's why I sustained the violation. I got all the information I needed to sustain my violation.
Could you pull up the interview of Assistant Chief Slavin? Do you have that there?
I don't know if I have the transcript.
Yeah, that's one.
What page are we in?
Unfortunately, I have it in. Oh, no, here, I'm sorry. Even though we're looking at it, it's
I probably have it.
240. I'm sorry,
I don't
240.
think that it is up there.
Yeah, I don't think I have Chief
So let me
Slavin.
just summarize this.
It's on page
You asked-
87 of mine.
You asked him about, on the first question, the second question, you sent him, I'm going to quote this, eventually, I'll start with kind of your email, because then we can back up into it a little bit. You sent an email, kind of an apology email, about maybe something you said during the time. Can you tell me what you were apologizing for? And then he goes on and talks about the satirical newspaper. He doesn't mention the comment to Lieutenant Meyer, which is long, and I can't remember everything that's in it. You never ask him about what comments did you make in the meeting on May 9th.
Right, like,
So he could have made a whole bunch of other comments, but because he wasn't asked under the Bill of Rights, he doesn't have to answer.
no, that's not what I said a second ago.
Okay, please expand upon
I said, you were referring to the end of my interview, when I
Right.
said, is there anything more as you want to say? That piece is their time to make their own statement.
it. Right. And he didn't-
That's all. I'm sorry,
Well,
I probably interrupted you again.
I've already interrupted you more, and I apologize for that. It says, but the question is, anything you want to say, is that an opportunity for him to say what the investigation is about? Because he does get, isn't he given some document about what the investigation is about?
He can say anything he wants at that point. Commander Minor spoke for, 30 minutes at the end of his. So it's a time for them to say anything they want.
Okay, so you're not asking him anything he wants to say about what the topic of the investigation is. You're just asking him generally anything he wants to say.
Yes, sir.
So by him not telling you that he made the comment towards Lieutenant Myers, that's not deemed to be inaccurate or a deflection or deceptive?
No,
Do you think Assistant Chief Slavin had a motive not to tell you about his comment to Lieutenant Myers?
I don't know what his motive is.
Based upon your background and experience as an internal affairs investigator, do you think he had a motive not to tell you about his comment towards Lieutenant Myers?
No, because later on, Lieutenant Smith said that Chief Slavin said he didn't remember. So I took that to mean that what comments he made.
And this may be a little odd. You have a senior officer making what has been characterized as a homophobic remark, asking for, not that, at least, asking about someone's sexuality, doesn't remember it. Would you be concerned as an officer of the Scottsdale Police Department that someone is asking another person about what generally is considered a pretty private matter and not remember their name?
Well, the context of the meeting was, and what everybody said, it was that joking and jovial, and they're trying to lighten the mood. So it's not that I found that he made a serious statement about that or made an accusatory statement or was harassing. It was just that he looked at Lieutenant Myers and said something like, "What are you, gay?" Or I'm not sure how he phrased it.
Let me follow up on that. The issue of matter, the matter at issue was something that occurred in the city of Scottsdale, and he brought up a satirical newspaper that had suffered 2 terrorist attacks, and that was to lighten the mood.
No, that's not how it ever occurred.
Okay, explain,
So
because I've read
they-
through
they-
that, it just,
they were
I'm having
talking-
difficulty with that.
Yeah, they were talking about a partnership that they have with some other jurisdictions, and it was about coordinating assets for possible terrorist attack. And they talked about the training that I think it was Chief Slavin and one other person, had received from a French commander, or he led it somehow, who actually happened to be at the site of both Charlie Hebdo and the other attack, which was, I think, a bar or restaurant type thing, like how those occurred. And so Chief Slavin, what I understand from my thing, was trying to remember the name of the newspaper, Charlie Hebdo. And then, because he just got done talking about, we're gonna be criminally investigating another officer. And he said that the room was heavy, and he was trying to lighten the mood, so he's trying to remember the name of the newspaper. Someone made a French type accent, French, Canadian French, but in like and that he turned to, I think, Lieutenant Tommy Myers, who may have remembered the name of the newspaper, and said something akin to, "What are you, gay?" That's the context. It wasn't about.
When you asked Commander Minor about anyone being directly offended, what was the word directly meant to modify?
Well,
Being offended?
the modification, it's a modifier of the word offended, and what my intent was to find out was, were you personally offended by the comments? And do you know anybody else that was personally offended by those comments? Because,
You didn't ask that, though. You asked if anyone was directly offended.
I know, I was
Which is
explaining,
different. Okay,
you asked me
I
to
just wanna
explain,
make
that's what I was
sure.
doing.
So did you conclude what you've been told by another witness or another person who you've interviewed?
Yeah, sometimes, I just did it.
What is the purpose, what was the purpose of that?
To say that we know that something happened. They may say something, and I'm using it to come back at them with another question. They said, "John hit Joan," and I say, "Well, Joan already told me that she hit you, that you hit her." So I can use any of that I can as an investigator to get them to bring me some information. So I'm just trying to elicit the truth.
Okay, when Commander Minor did not tell you about Lieutenant Gwinnett and perhaps others, and you said earlier that you intended to go, you knew you could go back and talk to him again.
Yes.
Why did you go back and talk to him?
Because I had all the information I needed to sustain the violation. Had more than enough to sustain the violation.
You also went back, however, to interview Assistant Chief Slavin after the investigation was closed.
I did
Why
not
was
do
it?
Right. That wasn't me, that was Sergeant Gollihart.
Okay, so we'll get to that. Is that typical that that would occur?
Well, that was on the advice of legal to go and re-interview them.
I'm going to ask Respondents' Counsel, since she called this witness, any follow-up to either the Vice Chair or any questions?
I do, thank you. Sergeant Lewis, I want to ask you some questions about things that would or would not constitute violations of AR 333.1 or .2. And I will read to you from Part 1, which prohibits, quote, offensive jokes, comments, or compliments of a sexually suggestive nature. Did you conclude that Chief Slavin had made offensive jokes of a sexually suggestive nature?
No.
The AR Part 1 goes on to talk about insulting, demeaning, derogatory remarks directed at a member of a protected class. Did you interpret the comment about the French newspaper to be directed toward any member of the city's department or employees?
No.
The only comment that was directed toward an actual city employee, Lieutenant Myers, did you make a conclusion as to whether Lieutenant Myers was being targeted or otherwise singled out or insulted as a result of Lieutenant Myers' sexuality?
No, Lieutenant Myers said he was not targeted. He didn't remember the comment, if I remember correctly.
I will read to you from AR 333, Part 2. Engaging in humor or bantering in the workplace that may intimidate, offend, embarrass, or demean another person. Did you feel that was the more appropriate
Yes.
finding? You were asked some questions about your knowledge of the sexuality of witnesses. Would it be appropriate or desirable for you to inquire as to witnesses' sexuality as a matter of routine?
Never.
Would it be appropriate or desirable for you to seek out people not involved in an incident because you knew that they were a member of a protected class, and to ask them to be a representative of that protected class for insight?
That'd be highly inappropriate.
Chief Slavin failed to mention the Lieutenant Myers comment during the first interview, is that right?
That's correct.
Did Chief Slavin give you any indications at any time, either when you spoke to him or in your review of the transcripts, that he intended to withhold evidence from internal affairs?
Never.
Did you draw any conclusions as to whether Chief Slavin attempted to volunteer information regarding his own offense?
I thought he was forthright with what he provided, and the fact that he sent an email the next day to everybody, including his boss.
You are the witness who will be able to tell us what Chief Slavin's tone, demeanor, and inflection was when you interviewed him firsthand. Did you observe anything about Chief Slavin's tone or inflection or demeanor that led you to conclude that he was withholding or holding back or wanting to argue with you?
Not at all.
Okay. From the review of the transcript that I did, it almost looks the contrary. One question and then pages-long answers. Is that right?
That's similar to Lieutenant Bonnet.
Okay, but not similar to Commander Miners?
That's correct.
You did not ask the chief about the reason for timing of any investigation, is that right?
That's right.
Does that matter to how you conduct the investigation?
It doesn't matter to IA at all.
IA is given an investigation and you investigate. That's it.
That's correct.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Sabalik?
Yes, please, and I'm going to jump around topics a little bit. But let's start with the last part, the last group of questions that you were just asked. During Commander Miner's first interview, is it your testimony that you received information or body language or responses that you believed that he was withholding information from you?
No.
And if you had, you would have followed up and asked him why, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I might not have asked him why he was giving me tone or body language, but I would have cued in on it.
Okay. Now, I need to ask some foundation here because you were certainly only read part of this. So the first part is the legal standard used to determine if the conduct is inappropriate or objectionable is whether a reasonable person, as a member of a protected class, would view it that way. For example, whether a comment of a sexual nature is offensive to a woman would be determined from the perspective of a reasonable woman, i.e., would the comment be offensive to a reasonable woman? The same standard applies to acts directed at members of any protected class. That's from AR 333, the one that was in place at the time. Are you familiar with that standard?
I am more now that you read it to me, but yes.
Okay. Now, another part of AR 333.1, Part 1, says insulting, demeaning, derogatory remarks, communications, and materials, including but not limited to posters, cartoons, magazines, directed at a member of a protected class or relating to a person's status as a member of a protected class. Do you recall that as being part of Part 1?
Yes.
So do you think, because I think you've said that you believe that you could put yourself in the perspective of a reasonable person who is of a protected sexuality.
Yes.
Do you think it would be insulting, demeaning, or derogatory remark to turn to someone and say, what, are you gay? As a way to break the mood in a meeting?
Well, my friends and family members that are gay don't mind the word gay. And I think it was insulting and demeaning, but I don't think it was harassing or targeting anybody.
Okay.
So that the fact that someone says gay, or are you gay, is not inherently offensive.
Well, I mean, the board can read the policy for themselves, but it doesn't say targeting. It says relating to a person's status as a member of a protected class, okay? So the question that was asked, I want to see if you agree with this. The question that was asked is, are you gay, right?
Oh, yes.
And that relates to a
Or
protected...
something like that, right?
Sure, and that relates to a protected class under the policy, right?
Yes, it does.
And it is your belief when you wrote your investigation and finding that that is not viewed by a member of the protected class as insulting, demeaning, or a derogatory remark. Is that your position?
That's my position.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. So, do you believe, based off of your analysis of AR 333, that members of the Scottsdale Police Department had reported a violation of AR 333 to their chain of command in May?
Yes.
And is it your understanding, sitting here today, that Chief Rodbell chose not to do anything when they actually, or he chose not to initiate an internal affairs investigation when this matter was reported? Is that accurate?
Is it? You're going to have to re-ask that, I'm sorry.
So in May, Chief Rodbell did not initiate an internal affairs investigation related to Chief Slavin, correct?
I've got that, yeah.
And in May, Chief Rodbell was told, supposedly, there was 2 derogatory remarks made during the meeting, right? That's
Yes.
your conclusion? But Chief Slavin said in an interview, I only made 1 offensive comment,
He
right?
did say that in an interview.
We're going to go over that in a second. But he did say that in an email, right? As the chair has pointed out, I made a comment. It was a
That's not
singular
how I
word.
took the email,
Okay,
so that's how I investigated it.
okay. You took that email to refer to multiple comments?
Yes, I did.
Apologizing for multiple
And
comments?
that's what I wrote.
Okay. Okay. You were asked questions by members of the Personnel Board that, does it take a complaint by Damian Mendoza, the union president, to spur an internal affairs investigation? Or can an internal affairs investigation be spurred by an employee complaint up their chain of command. Do you recall that question?
Yes, it could happen all kinds of ways.
Okay. And in this case, Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor and Chief Pop reported an issue up, and it did not spur an internal affairs complaint until Damian Mendoza filed his email, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And AR 333 does not allow that type of delay, does it?
I don't know if it has timeframes in there, Steve, so, but I would imagine that it should be as soon as possible.
You don't, so you're not familiar as to whether AR 333 says that, and I thought you were asked questions by the vice chair, that AR 333 says that things are supposed to be investigated completely and timely.
As soon as possible.
I'm sorry, as soon as possible.
That's what I said.
Okay. Do you think that a delay of 7 weeks is as soon as possible?
It depends upon the facts and the context.
In these facts and context, do you think that this matter was investigated pursuant to AR 333 as soon as possible?
All I can answer is when I got the IA investigation, I did it as soon as possible. What transpired before, I had no idea about.
Sir, I will
Excuse
consider.
me, sir, to begin to keep a clean record, if it were part one investigation, it should be, I'm sorry, that's where you're supposed to contact human resources immediately to address the situation. Not the part two.
Okay. Switching different time periods. You were asked about the time limits in GO 1410, and it's your testimony that the chief can direct an investigation to happen out of time if he wants to, right?
Yes, sir.
The chief can also make the determination that this investigation is out of time and it's not moving forward, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let me review my notes for 1 second. I'm going to refer you to page 96 in my notes. And it is it's the Slavin transcript.
I'll try to find it on yours, but
It's the last page of the Slavin transcript. So on the bottom left, it's 96. And then on the bottom right, it's actually 96. And it's my exhibit 19. And let me ask you a couple foundational questions first. You gave testimony in response to the chair that you asked the question, is there anything else that you want to add? And I think it's your testimony that at that point, it's basically their time where they can say what they want for you to consider, right?
yes, correct.
Now, there's a limit to that though, I think. So someone, when they answer that question, is not allowed to provide false statements to internal affairs, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in this case, once again, since I think words matter here, Chief Slavin's last answer was, I would just reiterate, that comment was stupid, and as I said in my email, I certainly didn't mean to offend anyone, and I'm sorry that it did, right?
That's what the transcript says, yes.
Was that consistent with your recollection, or?
Yes, that's what the transcript says. It's consistent with my recollection.
Okay, and every single pronoun there refers to a single comment, doesn't it?
Yes,
And you never went back to follow up as part of your investigation as to whether there was more than a single comment and that his email was incomplete, did you?
I never went back to him. I discovered that in my investigation.
Okay. Now, counsel for the city asked you some questions about the public record that would have already existed. So supposedly this public record that would have existed was Chief Slavin's email out to the members of the command staff where the city says that he admitted his misconduct. Do you recall the questions and the answers you gave?
The public record being emailed, yes.
But that public record would have been incomplete and misleading, correct?
Not that I know.
Well, that email tends to tell the reader that only a single comment was made, correct?
That's not how I took it, and that's what I told the chair.
Okay. That email makes no mention of turning towards a subject at the meeting and asking them about their sexual orientation, does it?
No.
So do you think that that email is as complete of a public record as is required in an internal affairs investigation?
Yes, because that's how I took it.
You think that that email is as complete as an internal affairs investigation? I don't know if you heard my...
Oh, no, I just said it's complete as a public record.
You believe that your findings were more accurate than, or more complete than what was in the email, correct?
Yes.
Do you think that Lieutenant Bonnet, for bringing a complaint forward, deserved to have a fair investigation done?
I think anybody that brings a complaint forward deserves to have a complete investigation done.
Can you think of any good reason why an investigation wasn't done until Damian Mendoza brought a complaint forward?
I have no idea the conversations.
Okay, that's all I have.
I have one more.
Any follow-up?
Yes, one more,
Vice
Mr.
Chair?
Chair, thank you. Actually, two questions.
Excuse me?
I don't know who asked first. I know Slavin came in and asked for the case. And he said, how do I get a copy? I said, well, typically we give the subject officer a copy. And he said, no, I'll go through public records request.
Any idea what prompted the request for these transcripts weeks after the fact?
No,
No discussion of anything between that you were part of?
not that I remember, but I do know that subjects of interviews, subjects of investigations, sometimes do request their case. They want to see what everybody else said.
And if I was investigated, I would want to do the same thing, only I'd probably do it the day after the case was closed, not 5 weeks later.
I know that HOSA had requested copies of them also.
Okay, thank you, that's all, Chair.
Council for respondent, Ms. Day, you have some follow-up?
Just one question, if I may. There's been a lot of discussion, Sergeant Lewis, about one comment versus 2 comments. Whether it was 1 comment or 2 comments, IA sustained the allegation against Chief Slavin in full, did it not?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And having something be double sustained, if there are 2 comments versus 1, is that a thing?
No.
Those are all the questions I have, thank you.
Mr. Sabala, can you follow up?
Just one single question. Can't the nature of what those comments were, what specifically was said, change the severity of the investigation and potentially the discipline?
It can change the discipline. It doesn't change the severity of, I can't make it super sustained. It was sustained.
I said 1, but I gotta make it 2. You could have sustained part 1 versus part 2, depending on the comment that was made.
That's right, that wasn't my finding.
That's all.
Anything further? Chair, I have nothing further. May the witness be excused.
Thank you for your time and patience.
Check and make sure.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Hey, did you hear my admonition at the
Yes,
very
sir.
beginning? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a long day for you. Let's take a break. It is a little bit past 4:20. Let's go.